The middle months of 1092 would come to be known as the Bloody Summer. The Norman Civil War had desiccated the dukely brothers Robert and William, all for naught as the final brother Richard towered unblemished over the duchy. Yet this alone was not the cause for the time to be entrenched in memory by its morbid name. The greater measure of blood was yet to be spilled, as anyone could have predicted, when King Philip of France declared war to conquer England. It was a war that aimed to place on the English throne a man with the blood of the Norman line, but the name and heart of a true Frenchman, or so the king believed. Yes, all France at last marched for Robert. At the king's behest, thousands of troops from Flanders to Aquitaine gathered under the banners of House Capet, their baggage trains piled high with provisions for a long and brutal campaign. Realm against realm, nation against nation perhaps you could say, king against king to be more precise, and all in the name of the tragic hero Count Robert of Maine. Had God finally taken note of all the conquests, territorial and copulatory, that Robert had dedicated to the Holy Lord? This exquisite turn of fate was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, for its onset brought out the best in the recently grim Count. He had adopted the mantle of king already in his own mind. There was something more stately about demanding that people make way for him on his approach, compared to his previous use of elbows, spitting, and growls. When, after a minor battle at Les Charité, he captured Duke William III of Normandy, his behaviour was exquisite. The executioner's well-polished axe was left dormant alongside its crestfallen master. Instead, William simply abdicated the duchy back to Robert, and was imprisoned in Rouen in a room fit for a count he kindly remained. Knowing Robert, there is perhaps another explanation for his soft approach. He wished to extend some kind of amnesty to Richard, who was still in open rebellion with 3 times Robert's numbers. Richard was not impressed, and so his conquest of Normandy continued unopposed, even now threatening to capture the prison in which a comfy cell awaited him. Robert could do nothing, his favourite thing to do in any other circumstance. The chill of winter was bitter indeed, with the prospect of his inevitable dethroning hanging over his old haunt in Le Mans, the hiding place for his doomed court. Robert was in no mood to rule, and civil war stripped everyone's taste for usual court business anyway. So it was that Duchess Regent Adeline, of no other names or distinctions, sat beside Princess Mare of the royal house Stenkeling, ruling what little there was to be ruled, while the noble Duke Robert warmed himself upstairs with the latest curious courtier to win his attention. The achievements of the chamber were matched by the coming of spring, warming the Duke's mood enough for him to thoroughly sour his grapes, in a good way. He realised that he didn't have to sit and watch his lands be coiled around his brother. He could look north, to his new home, to the war on England that France was easily winning. He finally got around to thanking King Philip for his helpful warring, and announced that the men of Normandy who weren't mere bandits and allies of chaos would join the rightful conquest of England. Such proclamations were spread throughout the duchy. Well, thought Richard's men, we aren't bandits and allies of chaos, and it's going to be a lot more fun to pillage some place that we don't care about than our own homes. Why don't we return to go with the Duke? Overnight, the rebel army disappeared. By the graces of God and all his servants, Normandy was back in Robert's damp hands once again. There was just one little problem. From the perspective of the nobles of Normandy, everything had gone wrong. They had done their best to be rid of Robert, but now here he was again, more arrogant and entitled than ever. The screeching Duke had styled himself king, and wished all to know it just as strongly as he did not wish to hear the troubles of the noble families. thousands dead in a civil war, and only back progress had been made. Robert had allowed William to rule for too long. The people and lords had been shown the greener pastures that might be theirs if only the troublesome troll under the bridge could be dealt with. One Count Ralph of O became the ringleader of a fresh conspiracy to give power to William. The schemers had the troops to achieve their goal, and only needed some time to rest the men of the realm in preparation for more fighting. It seemed that there was only one way to end this madness. If William was forever to be challenging him, Robert would simply have to remove William from the picture. Then there was the matter of Richard, who had committed crimes almost equal to their younger sibling. What would become of him? Robert approached the matter in the traditional House Normandy fashion. He offered Richard an excuse to kill his own brother, and suddenly Duke and Pretender were on speaking terms again. Leaving his brothers to a cloak and dagger war in France, Robert took what few men he had left and sailed for England. It was the worst move he possibly could have made, with the duchy barely holding itself together. As soon as he was a good stone's throw from the shore, more lords suddenly pledged to support William's claim, and the rebels tripled in strength. Ralph of O could now demand Robert's surrender on imprisoned William's behalf. Robert would hear nothing of this. That is not to say he refused to listen, only that he was being bounced around on the English Channel and forcibly decorating the floors of his galley. The demand was heard by Regent Adeline then, to whom this manly drama was foreign and, in her opinion, stupid. And if Ralph had known what Adeline would say next, then he probably would have agreed that he was playing quite the fool. Amid the stately bickering of court, Adeline had visited William in the prisoner tower on several occasions, and had been quite impressed with him. He was, as was often said of him, not like other men. His soft voice and discerning eye were quite refreshing to this lonely merchant's daughter, a woman forced to sit atop a man's world. When Richard, a man who she and William could agree had far too gaudy tastes, was rumoured to be sweet-talking the guards with murderous intent, Adeline took pity on the darling ex-duke. To get to the point, Adeline took great pleasure in informing Ralph of O that William had been smuggled away to luxurious Lecce in the heel of Italy on her orders. Sunburn aside, he would be safe from undue harm there, and exile from Normandy was not such an unjust punishment for his crimes after all. Ralph and company were left embarrassed. Formal exile shattered William's legitimacy for the time being, so there was nothing they could demand anymore. They trudged home, leaving only the smirking maids and joking bards as the legacy of that once fateful day. Across the Channel, a most familiar scenario had emerged. As it happened, England was also being invaded by the Norwegians. It was 1066 all over again, only this time the Norwegians had already destroyed the English armies, so all the Anglo-Saxon nobility could do was wait to see which foreign conqueror came out on top. Robert's involvement in the early stage of the war was limited to a skirmish on the southeastern coast, for he received news of the drama in Rouen and much more besides. The unruly nobles were firmly set in their anything-but-Robert policy for the duchy. With Richard too embarrassed to do anything after so many rugs had been pulled out from under him in quick succession, the rebel-rousers had turned to Cecilia, the eldest of Robert's younger sisters. Maybe everyone in the family was going to have a pop at usurpation someday. Robert didn't especially care about the threat of a mere female, but he did care that he was no more wealthy than the average innkeep after all these years of war. He returned home to disband his armies and await the crown his good king was slaving to acquire. While such masculine labours took place, more feminine ones had been playing out in Rouen, resulting in Robert arriving home to something just as important as a crown, an heir. He named the child Robert, for 'twas the best name. It seemed that his most recent choice of nocturnal companion had achieved that which his wife or his regent had not, or at least had not told him about. Her name was Bava, and she happened to be the child of Gerbeau, the great liar of Paris. While Robert Sr. announced Robert Jr. as a legitimate child, the well-known truth to his lineage was confirmed by the Duke's choice to have Grandpa Gerbeau be the newborn's guardian. The omens surrounding the new child's arrival were rather dire. The Civil War's stresses and privations had weakened the Norman people, to the delight of the typhus bacteria taking its greedy toll on peoples high and low across the duchy. Robert was not overly concerned with the matter. After all, he didn't have this illness people were complaining about. What he did have was another sister who might be plotting to kill him, and a god that considered his life to be the stage of a great comedy for all the angels to enjoy. To be more specific, he learned that the Holy Roman Empire had started up another war for the border region of Zealand. It was exactly the matter which had caused his father's invasion of England to fail, caused him to not have the crown of England on his head already. Now, at this critical time, the wound was reopened, completing the strange cycle of history Robert had fallen into. Would the king betray Robert yet again? Would he selfishly go back on his word to protect his overly large realm when the injustice of Robert's unroyalty remained? Only time could tell. While it was the era of greatest hope for Robert, it was also a miserable low point. He was impoverished, his men were dead, his duchy was full of traitors, and his only ally was the coalition of bacteria that found a way to squeeze the life out of William of Evreux, the sponsor behind Cecilia's usurpation plans. Cecilia's popularity would suffer, but never was Robert safe. Richard had found the gall to resume gathering his own little rebel cabal. For the best, really, since it gave Robert something to focus on, a nice, achievable goal. Fratricide was the great uplifter of Normandy, after all. He could sit back, hear the heralds reporting on the war from time to time, and take relaxing, stealthy walks with his crossbow in the woods where Richard occasionally went hunting. To be a great king, it takes all sorts. The Kingdom of France was beset by enemies on all sides. To the north, the Norwegian armies contested Duke Robert of Normandy's claim to England. To the east, the mighty and unbreakable Holy Roman Empire poured soldiers beyond count into Flanders, seeking to force King Philip to surrender Zealand to its rightful owners. To the south, a trickle of men from Aragon wandered the countryside, slightly inflating the price of ale for weeks in every town they encountered. Robert knew which front was right for him. The caravans of Aragon, bound for England to support their allies, were easy prey for what few men the Duke had left to command. No enemy had drawn closer to Paris than these sweaty southerners, and thus no man was more loyal to the king for stopping them than the champion Robert. Perhaps a few ears among the French court received these words from Gerbeau well. Robert's ears were rather taken ill when whispers reached him that his brother Richard may have some notion of the plot against his life. It was said that even the milkmaids had to utter a password, changed daily, just to pass from one wing of his Vexin estate to another, on pain of death. Alas, the estate now seemed to be always hiring. It was no cause for great concern, for all knew that all of the Normandy family wanted Robert dead. What was wrong with him returning the sentiment? Others had even agreed to carry out the brotherly business in Robert's name, including Count Barthélemy of Anjou, a man ennobled by Robert in a surely unrelated coincidence, who was actually rather busy at that time preparing a pitched battle outside Paris. The French nobles were treated to the sight of Norman banners atop piles of Spanish dead, followed by a visit from a breathless Robert in battered, bloodied armour. Oh, how impressed they were with his manly sweating and heroic state of unwash. Oh, how little they knew that his armour was battered because he couldn't afford to have it repaired, and the blood stains were in fact a mix of an exotic cinnamon sauce and pork fat. They were only further convinced that sending their peasants to England was right, proper, and according to God's plan. The next act in Normandy's coinless cabaret was a fight with the English. A band of men had fled from the Norwegian conquest of Cornwall and ended up on the wrong side of the wet bit, as Robert put it to his entourage, before laughing uncontrollably at his own irreverent wit. Everyone else must have laughed while he had his eyes closed and his mind set on hyperventilating, he later thought. The English were slaughtered, by the way, and delivered cold to Paris as another trophy for King Philip, who was known as Philip the Cruel for very much related reasons. Overall, 1094 and 1095 had been rather successful ones for Robert's cause, in that it had advanced substantially while he personally had done barely anything. Those miserable years of recent past seemed like a whole different life. In fact, Robert was so cheerful, so agreeable, and so well-wined that he actually ended up spending some time with that strange woman who sometimes ate with him, his wife. Adeline and Bava had found their place in Robert's bed taken one night, and after one thing led to various others, Robert now had a legitimate child, a daughter named Solène. It just so happened that King Philip had sired a child of his own recently, a son whom he named Philip, for 'twas the best name. This child was heir, so whichever girl bagged him as a husband would soon be Queen of France. Robert was now at the king's door with bags aplenty. For Philip, his pet Norman was the ideal choice for a new family member, for that way, when Robert was King of England, their families would be entwined, and perhaps House Capet would find a way to usurp the Normandy legacy. Robert was thinking exactly the same way, in reverse. The two men rose a toast to an agreed betrothal, and the usefulness of those bothersome infants. Now, while all this had been going on, the French forces in England had apparently been very busy. In April 1096, a message arrived from King Merliswegen, his last message as king. What this meant was quickly to be known by all with ears, for the screams of delight were unmissable, to all with eyes, for the parades, dances, and that showboating grin were a sight to behold, and to all Normans with a sense of pride, for now their taxes were to be paid to the King of England, making their lands part of England, as far as such labels mattered at the time. At last, a good 30 years late, there was no Count Robert of Maine, no Duke Robert II of Normandy, only King Robert the Proud of England. King! King! He was king! King of all England! Well, not all England, actually. For while the French had defeated the English, they never had defeated the Norwegians, meaning that Robert had in fact inherited a throne with very few troops at its command in the middle of a war that was being quite badly lost by all accounts. Robert was only to be the interim king before King Olaf III of Norway arrived. The southwest of England was held by the Norwegians already, as well as the English capital at Westminster. Lucky that Robert proclaimed Rouen was the capital of England now instead. After all, while he really did want to be King of England, he didn't want to actually have to go there. The lords of England could simply sail to Rouen whenever court was called, and they'd probably be really happy about it. Unfortunately, an initial trip to England was going to be unavoidable if the Norwegians were to be reasoned with. Robert mustered his armies and told his new cadre of English landowners to do the same. If Robert's reception by the nobles of Normandy had been frosty, the mood among the high-born Anglo-Saxons was positively glacial. There was little demand for a French king, especially one who had, so far, only brought war, death, and misery to England through his contestable inheritance. Robert needed to tread carefully. Foremost among the English was Duke Edwin of Mercia. He was a famous military leader, a relative of the old king, and personally ruled nearly half of what remained of England. Furthermore, he sat upon the shoulders of the old kings of Mercia who had dominated the region in a well-remembered age gone by. Controlling him was central to controlling England. Did Robert realise this? Perhaps. Edwin had a teenage son, his heir. Robert had a 30-something sister with an ever-growing collection of daggers. Both were unmarried. Thus, the family of the new king was tangentially bound to that of the old, and more directly to that of the king-maker. Plus, Agatha was now destined to live in Mercia, meaning Bava could have her room in the castle one day. Which result was Robert's primary objective remains unknown. The case of Edwin was far from closed, however. He was a duke with the cut of a prince, for in English high society there was a custom whereby the most elite of the elite would formally select who would be king. In times gone by, they would usually select a descendant of the previous king, so in practice a royal family was maintained. But now they called upon their roughly defined right to select whoever they thought best instead, and no one related to Robert could meet such criteria. Duke Edwin, then, was next in line to the throne. If someone just so happened to kill Robert, an Anglo-Saxon could rule England again. It must have been rather tempting. For now, though, things went smoothly for Robert, as the Norwegian army had apparently sailed home for one reason or another, leaving the Normanno-English force plenty of time to start taking the forts and towns left under Olaf's banner. The obliging King Philip even agreed to send more troops to help out. In the county of Wiltshire there was trouble afoot. A strange religious sect had grown to dominate spiritual thought in the area, thoughts that were less and less spiritual actually, and more violent. They were known as the Fraticelli cult. They took offence to how the church was eye-wateringly rich in a time of general poverty and downtroddenness among the people as a whole, despite various tenets of said church damning such an arrangement. Well, what was to be said for all that? All people could do was ask the men of the church, for they had a virtual monopoly on the language of Latin, the language in which the word of God was exclusively conveyed. And they said it was fine for them to have all that wealth. Among the few outside of the church who could read Latin was Robert, as it happened, thanks to Orderic's tutoring and his own transient interest in theology. However, if you think Robert dove in to research the matter further, you haven't been paying attention. He was more concerned with shipping another of his sisters off to some teenage groom in a far-off land. Denmark would take the burden of Constance from Rouen Castle. He'd have room for another girlfriend now. As spring became summer in 1097, Robert received a visitor from a supposed friend of former King Merliswegen. He said that Duke Edwin was planning to kill Merliswegen, and requested that Robert arrest Edwin in order to protect the integrity of the realm, blah blah blah. Robert rushed for the soonest boat to England even before the messenger finished his plea. Such incredible dedication to justice, even for an old enemy, brought tears to many who witnessed the scene. Robert sailed through the night, rode for several days, and finally stormed into the Mercian court in Leicester. The surprised assembly awkwardly stood and bowed to the glistening king, topless in all his rotundity, rendered breathless by the stairs before the doors, yet still lumbering forwards at the Duke. In time he mustered the air to shout out at Edwin, claiming that he was fully aware of the plot to kill Duke Merliswegen. The tension rose as Robert resumed gasping for breath, and all looked to Edwin, who himself looked to his generals. They slowly nodded. Mercia was ready for war, and they would stand by the Duke against this wild French king. Just as Edwin was readying himself to challenge Robert, the king blurted out, "And that is beautiful, I want it too," in his very best English. Indeed, so far he had only learned enough to get by with the wenches, and that was as far as he planned to take his education on this topic. It seemed to work though. The court cheered, Edwin smiled and stood to embrace the king, a sticky regret, and all was well for all but Merliswagen. His most powerful vassal bonded with in the Norman style, Robert could resume the simple campaign to oust the Norwegians from the southwest. In January of 1098, he received news that King Olaf was willing to withdraw entirely in exchange for peace and safe passage for his men. It was exactly the deal the English needed, although it took some time to convince Robert of that, for he was rather enjoying racking up victory after victory with all of the English and French soldiers he'd been lent. Luckily for the Norwegian troops, they were a lot of effort to kill, so Robert was eventually convinced by his bedmates that staying with them was better than playing general. In March, the Norwegian claim to England was dropped. Now the realm was Robert's and Robert's alone, but for the hideaways of Cornwall and Devon, who didn't recognise Olaf's authority, so remained unofficially Norwegian. Blemishes aside, Robert had done it. He had wrestled back the crown promised to him by his father and by his destiny. His metaphorical stock had risen sharply, so much so that even poor Richard came to bask in his elder brother's glories. He asked to betroth his daughter Avis to Robert the Younger, King Robert's heir, and perhaps one day also heir to England. Robert could not for the life of him stop laughing. If he had known his brother would humiliate himself in such a fashion, Robert could never have even considered murdering him. The laughter, debuted in front of Richard himself, sufficed for an answer. Robert had far higher ambitions for his son than his own niece, heir to nothing, especially given that if one asked those bejewelled bishops whether they would conduct such a ceremony, they might remind you that such marriages were forbidden by God, unless you paid the hefty special dispensation fee. So then, now a life of luxury lay before the illustrious Robert. Edwin was trying to conquer one of the Welsh kingdoms, apparently. Ah yes, send a few thousand men and my regards. It was a long way to the top of the medieval world, but the view was beyond beautiful. Robert of England. Robert of England. Robert of England! Yes, it sounded just as sweet every time. Somewhere on a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, a small canoe ground into the beach, its lone passenger breathlessly announcing the news to another elated tribe. He deserved as much, the village elder surely nodded. Perhaps the news had not spread as far as Robert imagined, but the English certainly knew of it. Hence their innocent billhooks were kept unusually sharp, for a French king was not to be tolerated for long. Robert was one step ahead of them though. He had taken into account the secret route to any Englishman's heart: promise to kill the Welsh. Yes, he would press Kingmaker Edwin the Bold's claim on some petty kingdom of Britain's mountainous annex, pleasing both the most important vassal in the realm and giving all true Englishmen a chance to exercise their pride. It also just so happened to make his Kingdom of England that little bit bigger and more glorious. Did I mention that he was King of England? He would have wanted me to make that quite clear. He couldn't risk his own troops in this war given his precarious tenure in Westminster, but a quick word to Paris ensured that the French army was at his beck once again. By now, King Philip was probably starting to see through Robert's mystique, but a king's word was rather scrutable, and hence was kept at great expense to all those would-be scrutinizers. The Welsh and their allies were dispatched at little cost to Robert, but there was some adjacent trouble in the southwest. The Fraticelli cult had driven the people of Wiltshire into a frenzy. They were armed to the teeth and demanding the redistribution of the church's hypocritical hoards of wealth. Best have them killed, the bishops of the land agreed. Eager to stamp about the country to mark his territory, and to hunt the most dangerous game of all, Robert set out to slay his people. En route, the peoples of Gloucester saw their chance to rise up as well, ambushing Robert's army at Winchcombe. They achieved little, for the army was actually in a state of battle readiness at all times on account of tension between the commanders of its two main contingents, English Duke Edwin and French King Philip. Their troops had fought each other in the past, and weren't entirely shy of doing so again. When war cries were heard in the night, both factions emerged from their tents, smugly revealing that they had been sleeping in chainmail for just such an occasion. They began battle with the attackers, each presuming these ragged raiders to be their treacherous allies, and fighting with a righteous fury and pride that left little of Gloucester's anti-Robert brigade. The light of day revealed what had really happened, and everyone laughed, their eyes fixed on the nearest mace. These men would be keeping each other's awkward company for months and years as they besieged the many fortresses of northwest Wales. The king they were fighting for paid them not even a single visit, for he had returned to his loyal 500 in Maine in order to see off attacks made by allies of ailing Gwynedd. He was also eager to check in with his court in Maine, relocated from Rouen due to some more nasty business with the surprisingly extensive network of Welsh sympathisers. He found Regent Adeline to be in good spirits, on account of all the bothersome lords being off on campaign. Their reunion produced for him another son, bringing him up to 3 children by 3 different mothers. The spirit of William the Bastard lived on indeed. By virtue of having a whole kingdom to tax, Robert had saved up a little money. After a stressful few years, it was definitely time for a treat. He splurged out on a second duchy, creating all the regalia, heraldry and precious metal accessories required for him to call himself the Duke of Gwynedd. Since Gwynedd was mostly administered by the Duke of Mercia, this meant nothing at all in practical terms, and for precisely that reason people were willing to humour the king's new claim. That said, perhaps humour is not the appropriate term, for plenty in England saw nothing funny about the king wasting the crown's purse in pursuit of vanity. In fact, the Duke of Wessex, one Edwig of Somerset, sent word to Rouen that he was formally recognising the Duke of Northumberland, one Edulf of Bamburgh, as King of England. Confuse yourself not with Edmund or Edwin, 2 of the other leading dukes of the land. These Englishmen hadn't made it easy for Robert, had they? Once the initial panic subsided, Robert breathed a sigh of relief. Edwin was the powerful one, and he was still loyal. So while Northumberland, Wessex and Kent declared a new English king had emerged, the better part of the realm remained intact. The question now was, could all this trouble be solved without Robert leaving his room in Rouen? He awoke one morning to the sight of Adeline, Bava and Mare at the foot of his bed, all proclaiming that they were bored and wanted to go to England themselves. Robert wryly asked how they knew each other, and recoiled at the balls of spit that were sent his way in response. Apparently the new pressure group in Rouen was Betrayed Mothers Against Robert, and they were going on a trip to Mercia to visit Princess Agatha and her famous dagger collection. With this, the king rushed to war to be among heavily armed and at least somewhat loyal company. He met up with the Duke of York, just in time to see him do battle with the Northumbrians. All the advantages were on Robert's side, and victory was soon won, but that wasn't the real struggle. That came when Duke Godwin asked where the promised monies from France were. Oh, did they not load them off the ships? Oh, have the ships already sailed back? Oh, what a bother. Just hang on, they'll probably realise their mistake and come back soon. The tale would see a few additions in its many retellings to each duke and count Robert met, including in one case a claim that the devil had rendered the gold invisible. The troops would have to fight Robert's war without pay then, and for one reason or another, Robert's army never swelled to be quite as big as he wished. In fact, when the great host was all gathered, it was smaller than the rebel force currently besieging Westminster. The money situation was only going to get worse if Robert waited for Philip to obligingly send more men, so into battle his armies went. He only needed about a third of his force to die to balance the books, perhaps less if he looted his own dead and sold the equipment to his own levies. While writing to Rouen to assess the demand for helmets with decorative arrows lodged in them, a messenger arrived from the far north. The letter, in no uncertain terms, was a declaration of war from the Duke of Lothian, vassal of England's noisy neighbour, the Kingdom of Scotland. The sheer amount of invisible gold Robert professed to know about needed to be a lot greater to sort this mess out. The good news was that about 500 metres outside of the tent in which Robert cursed through tightened lips at an exhausted Scotsman, the battle was progressing well. Robert was lucky to have Edwin of Mercia commanding his force, for his cunning quickly overcame the enemy's numbers. The rebels had amassed a great number of horsemen in their centre. Edwin sent his own smaller cavalry force out to fight them before they rushed back towards Robert's camp. Seeing a chance to turn the flight into a rout, the rebels pressed forwards. But alas, before the camp's perimeter was Edwin himself with some 1,200 infantry. The fleeing cavalry were let through to the rear, but then the footmen drew together into closer order, presenting a solid wall of shields to the rebels. The rebels found their horses quite afeard of the sudden obstacle, and then more so of the arrows Edwin's men began releasing over and through the grid of shields. After enduring many injuries, and seeing no way to continue on through the loyalist formation, the rebels were routed themselves. Edwin did not pursue, instead rushing to his right to smash the flank of the rebel left wing. They were set to routing also, joining the rebel right wing, which was already a good mile on their way to anywhere but that battlefield. Westminster was saved. Some days later, King Philip agreed to declare war on Lothian. England was saved. Some weeks later, the young Countess of Anjou passed away, her lands and wealth being left to her king. Robert was saved. After some laborious choreography, Robert had a ghostly, unmanned ship run aground at a time he had publicly predicted. On board was all the gold he had promised, returned to physical form by God as a sign that he was pleased with the loyalty of the English vassals. Said vassals were almost shocked to feel the coin in their hands. Was Robert actually something more than bluster? England certainly was doing well at the moment, especially with the French fighting the Scottish on their behalf. The English and French together finished off the rebels at Hartlepool. After such overwhelming numbers were presented, the rebel leaders decided to accept a peace treaty, restoring the realm to Robert. That was Northumberland, Wessex and Kent taught a lesson. Who would be next? The Dukes of York and Essex were plotting something of their own, the rumours had it. Indeed, England was full of many talented nobles with the legitimacy to rule the realm, all but one man, the man who called himself king. Thus, there seemed to be no end to the conspiratorial quagmire in sight. Robert was by now quite aware that the throne he had pined for was forever coated in thorns. Welshmen, Scotsmen, Englishmen, his vassals, his former king, his current wife, anyone could be an enemy. The jealousy of humankind knew no bounds before his glories. All these people were like leeches, sucking at his grandeur while cursing him between slurps. At least he wasn't like that, Robert thought, as the French army marched for the drenching autumn of Scotland. As it happened, the Scots had caught a boat down to France, and so when Robert took his army to Rouen for a big I won gala after the harvest, he stumbled into another battle. Edwin the Bold had come along for the festivities though, so Robert was free to slip back into the castle while the Mercian veteran directed the English longbowmen to scatter the Lothian force from afar. There's no place like home, especially when it comes to plotting the murder of your vassals, and Robert was not going to miss this chance. With a little sleuthing, a few private invites for drinks after court, and the spreading about of most of the Anjou legacy fund, he found the Duke of Essex to be not for want of mortal enemies. The conspirators were assembled, the blades were hidden, the squeaky floorboards of Bedford Castle were carefully mapped, and then Duke Edmund only went and died of old age. Ah yes, the Lord God was the greatest conspirator of them all, and he was cheap. Robert dedicated an evening's entertainment to his Holy Father as thanks, and was rewarded for his attentive and pious outlook with another legitimate child. When the child was to be named, he remembered the strange feeling he had got on that night, knowing that he had done the right thing in the eyes of the Lord by spending time with his wife. There was a strange, familiar comfort to such things, a homeliness that Adeline and Bava were lacking. Reminded of quieter times long ago, he named his new daughter after his mother. The new arrival entered a newly peaceful England, the war with Lothian having been completely won. The armies returned home and were disbanded. Robert's enemies had been crushed, and his similarly hostile allies needed to recuperate. For a time, all was well again. Robert spent time in Rouen, showing his bemused son Robert his custom floppy wrist sword-fighting style, telling his precious daughter Solène of all the food and finery she would enjoy as Queen of France when she grew up, and for the first time making Mère feel like she was at home in Normandy. He ransomed away the contents of Rouen dungeon, and spent the profits on another lavish set of accoutrements that just so happens to make him Duke of Anjou. Triple Duke, Triple Count, and King. Robert realised he needed to make sure everyone really appreciated how great he was, and announced a tournament in his own honour. All the great warriors of Normandy and England, and some from further afield, would gather to fight for the amusement of Robert's bloodthirsty subjects. A few high-profile deaths kept the peasants entertained throughout. The same could not be said for Duke Edwin of Mercia, who was forced to sit beside the king and listen to his endless commentary on the so-called mistakes each combatant made in their fighting style, posture, choice of weapon, armour configuration, hair, accent. Well, suffice to say, it was quite the display, and one that allowed Edwin to make up his mind on a certain matter, even long before he told his interpreter to spare him from the king's wisdom. It was the dawn of 1103, and the bloody whiff of betrayal was on the wind. The festivities of English and/or French and/or Norman King Robert had come to an end, festivities that by their martial nature had gotten everyone fired up for a bit of battle. They also just so happened to leave the finest warriors in the land in easy earshot of those who might want to organise a little extra round to the tournament. 5,000 men pledged to fight for Edwin the Bold of Mercia, if he ensured that the next tournament was hosted by someone more English and more generous with their praise and prizes. Robert was fully aware of this growing conspiracy. He knew that Edwin would betray him, for indeed all Frenchmen knew that there was no honour beyond the Channel. So then, he could play his ultimate trump card, present to the court evidence that Edwin was planning the murder of Merliswegen, the former King of England. Look, here is the blade with which the deed was to be done. Here are the instructions ready to be passed to hired thugs. Here is the forged will that leaves the old monarch's possessions to Edwin and... ignore that other name. Why did Robert have access to all these incriminating items? He had to insist people ignore that line of inquiry also, but the truth was quite clear. This hypocritical call-out sunk many a stomach in Rouen. Some guards rushed out of the castle without any orders. Probably going to arrest the murderer, Robert happily concluded, laughing heartily and alone amid a packed hall. The guards never returned, but news that half of England was rising up against Robert did. Duke Godwin of York, another claimant to the English throne, had joined the rebels, giving them more than enough men to defend against the army Robert was mustering in France, and plenty to defeat the doomed pro-Robert troops of England in the meantime. It was a familiarly hopeless situation for the poor, bouncy king, but by now he was well drilled on what to do at such low points. Through Paris he strutted, flanked by women whose beauty was matched only by their good value for money. Into the hall of King Philip they paraded, presenting the sullen monarch with some supposedly iconic golden horse models in barely used condition, and the news that Robert required just a few French men to resolve a minor issue. Although, he hastened to add, just to be safe, best send all the French men. Philip damned the day he had agreed to marry his heir to this clan of slack-jawed con artists and would-be barbarians, but such damning was tactfully silent, and instead all that was heard was his noble and honourable acceptance of Robert's truly heartfelt and deserving plea for aid. With King Philip's levy at his command, Robert could muster 8,000 against the 5,000 rebels besieging Westminster. The Yorkish men had sailed to Rouen to besiege the real seat of Robert's power, thus dividing the rebellion and giving Robert his chance for victory. Besides, he had cunningly brought his court with him to England, among them the English regent Adeline, who was able to produce something that was more truly iconic of House Normandy, a bastard child named William. This brought Robert's total up to 5. William the Bastard the Elder had been thoroughly upstaged, on the counts of offspring and mothers. These children could play their part for Normandy too. The infant Matilda was unknowingly betrothed to the 8-year-old Duke of Essex. Perhaps it wasn't the time to be organising such things, but perhaps Robert's authority allowed him to do what he wanted when he wanted. This argument deflected away the only objection Queen Mare was allowed to make. King Philip finally arrived with the rest of France's army, and together the two kings marched 10,000 men to recently fallen London for a decisive battle with the Mercians. There was little question that they would win, but amid all the day-to-day butchery of organising the victory, news slipped into camp here and there of strange goings-on in France. Philip had not only left some men behind, but those men were openly invading Robert's territory. Yes, the French king was not going to be taken advantage of anymore. As he had departed, he had slipped a letter to the kindly old Duke Etienne of Champagne overturning the legality of William the Bastard's conquest of Maine. House Dublin should thus take control of the region until the matter could be resolved. Robert's old foe, Duke Guillaume of Toulouse, wasn't going to miss a chance to avenge his previous disgrace in Maine and joined the new war. This was not ideal. With the impending loss of control of most of Normandy, on top of the ongoing loss of control of most of England, the things that Robert was actually king of seemed to be growing scarce. To stand any chance of putting Edwin back in his place, the place needed to be under Robert's control. That is to say, he needed to capture the Mercian capital of Leicester. That meant Normandy would have to endure, putting quite a lot of stress on Robert of Maine, by which I mean King Robert's son, who had been established as Count of Maine at a young age, for 'twas now proven to be the first step on the path to greatness after all. As you might imagine, the disorder across the realm impacted tax collection quite a bit, and Robert was quickly at the mercy of the moneylenders. The king reminded his followers that even he himself was working for free, so they should all follow his example. These followers eyed the golden crown encrusted with priceless jewels atop Robert's nodding head. Rouen had been taken by Yorkish troops, who had since been killed by the rampaging Toulousan troops. Who was in control now? No one, apparently, with even Robert's magistrates sneaking off to Paris. The law, or a version of it, would be applied by peasants' justice then, which for the capital of a great realm was not the best look. At least Robert managed to collect up the Mercian court from Leicester, placing them all in a big wooden cage that could be wheeled around upon the delighted insistences of King Philip. Now they just needed the big man himself to complete the collection. They moved to attack the Mercian army, which they outnumbered even more than last time, and defeated it soundly, just in time to hear that a group calling themselves the Thieves' Guild had taken control of the English-Norman capital. Robert, his hair greying and his mind tempered by these years of paranoia, war, and lobbying from betrayed mothers against Robert, was able to brush this development off. When asked why he was not so concerned, he insisted that he would take the good with the bad, as he always had done. No one could think of a time when he had done that, as opposed to taking the good and causing the bad, but there was something rather genuine about Robert's attitude, and something more kingly too. It was true that as his 50th birthday had come and gone, the on-again off-again King of England had become more introspective, taking time to reflect on lessons both fresh and well-aged from his life. Clearly he had made some enemies, and he really did want to rectify that, even if it was only to give himself a bit of peace and quiet. Thinking of old wisdom, he named the next child the Regent Adeline delivered to him, Orderic. After another solid victory over Edwin on the familiar fields near Hartlepool, he reviewed his troops and dismissed those he would not need, thus balancing the books and promising an eventual return from the depths of that perilous ocean they call debt. The men he still had, mostly paid for by King Philip or the Norman lords, defeated Edwin again outside his own capital, twice in quick succession, in fact. The Mercian cause was failing, and York had proven to be of no use to them. Robert spent time with his daughter Solène, encouraging her to read the words of God carefully, even if the other children thought it too timid a pastime for a future queen. God, Robert reminded her, was a fine ally to have when you needed to get things done, and he couldn't emphasize his low cost enough. Solène nodded along happily. The way she listened to him was unlike his court or his vassals. It was like she truly believed what he said, and even thought that he was clever for saying it. Truly his own offspring could recognize the greatness that spawned it. Such wholesome times were punctuated with good news. His men captured more Mercian territory, and his messengers brought him the apologies of Edwin the decreasingly bold. While Robert had a mind to punish the Duke further, his son and peoples were rather in dire need of help back on the continent. Paying taxes again was all the punishment Edwin got, for which he was actually very grateful, declaring a Mercian mercy to great applause. Meanwhile, Robert could promise Solène that the family would soon all be together again. Daddy, all 3 mummies, and a lot of strong, brave men would take her home and defeat the bad guys. Solène was elated, and Robert felt a strange, mutual feeling of happiness take hold of him. There was something about genuine appreciation that beat sycophancy every time. Too bad his court were too entitled and selfish to offer him anything more than the latter. At least Edwin was now being a good boy, taking command of the 5,000-strong army Robert had mustered and marching for the frozen keep at Le Mans, in which Prince Robert was held by the greedy troops of Champagne. The French host of nearly 6,000 soon arrived to contest their prize, and while they had the numbers on their side, to face Edwin of Mercia was no easy thing. Edwin had entrenched his men well, with stockades, trenches and stakes arrayed before his lines and camp. With the route through these obstacles being only narrow, very few men could charge in either direction. Thus the fighting took place at range, with arrows flying this way and that as Frenchmen scurried up to the defensive line and released what shots they dared, before rushing back under concentrated return fire, with shots from the huge English longbows breaking open their armour with ease. The French lost twice the number the English did in these skirmishes. Seeing the battle was making poor progress, some of the French troops fled the scene. Edwin saw his chance. he tipped the stockades over and levelled the rows of stakes, clearing the path for a mighty charge out into the open field. More and more French departed the failing project, allowing Edwin and company to press 1,000 or more man advantage against their chilly foe. A rout began, and the traitorous French were driven from Maine. Sparing Edwin had proven to be a wise decision indeed, for his services on the field of battle far outmatched any redemption that could be wrought by locking him in a dungeon. He could now be set to work clearing out the strongholds of Maine, while Robert made good on his promises of family time in Rouen, under the watchful eye of the Thieves' Guild, of course. As so often follows periods of war, an epidemic was spreading across Flanders into Normandy. Slow fever found its way up into the towers of Rouen to Robert's precious Solesnes. In constant pain she waited out the lengthening days, but she was rarely alone. With 4 parents and a few siblings still hanging around, her room remained rather busy. Busier still when members of the English and French court alike came to wish well to the princess and future queen. Solesnes admitted to Robert that such attention was uncomfortable for her, but Robert was quick to explain that these people around her were not to be feared, only to be used to better their family. As a queen, she would meet a great many people, and even a simple smile or kind word from such a position of power could compel the lesser folk to exert themselves day in day out in service to their betters. Solesnes believed him, for clearly such magic was at work in Robert's life, given that her 3 mothers were living in relative peace even with their vendetta unfulfilled. Indeed, Robert was actually working very hard to spend separate time with all 3, encouraging all not to kill each other or him. But quickly he realized that convincing them to like him could spell doom for his family, for their mutual complaints about him were all that unified them, preventing them from going after each other's children and God knows what else. Somehow he had to hold everything together, but not too tight. Never had he felt such pressure or stress as he did simply passing the time quietly in his own home. He didn't deserve this, he thought, but he couldn't quite think of whose fault all this was. After explaining the complex situation to Solesnes, she remarked that the best way to make everyone happy seemed to be to lie about everything. Robert beamed, knowing then that his daughter was destined for great things. A few months later, the defeated Champagne-Toulouse alliance finally surrendered their claim to Maine and returned home. After years of brutal tests, Robert was king of all England once more. The money was flowing, the court was starting to get itself back into working order, and Edwin was now busying himself and his men with another war in Wales. Ah yes, send a few thousand men, and my regards. Everything was back to normal. For now. In the spring of 1109, England was all abustle with the activities of war, but in a twist surely unfamiliar to the newest generation of its subjects, it wasn't a war against themselves. A coalition of Welsh and Irish lords had been defeated, extending Mercia down to the pleasant beaches of southwest Wales. As the reavers eagerly prepared to welcome any sightseers, the English army marched north through ever shorter fogs towards Scotland, where the Duke of Northumbria had taken the liberty of starting a land grab. In Rouen, Robert was teaching his daughter Matilda how to act like royalty. If the peasantry talk back to you, smack them in the face and absolutely don't forget to spit. When you're older, you'll have people to do this for you. Isn't life great, my little princess? Please don't help your mothers kill me, by the way. After a one-sided slaughter at Carlisle, England grew at Scotland's expense, and Duke Edulf was placed into Robert's debt. His bunch of favours owed and lives spared was maturing nicely, tucked away in a dark corner, awaiting pressing times. By autumn, the realm was at peace, slowly digesting its new conquests and continuing to generally mellow out. When one really thought about it, Robert's limp-wristed rule wasn't all that bad, especially if you just left him alone with his growing family. There was similarly good news for the church, as it heard that the Fraticelli cult had fallen out of fashion in Wiltshire. The clergyman had gone through the Bible again and again with a fine-toothed comb and produced proof of their right to wealth, with only a minimal number of generously broad translation choices. Thus the atmosphere calmed, and somewhere in the wooded river valleys of the Western Hills, the old King of England breathed a sigh of relief from the mouldy gourd of his luxury hole in the ground. Peaceful times suited peaceful business. Robert was sending correspondence to all the courts of Europe, inquiring after the richest and most beautiful princesses of the age, asking not of their value for money, but their lineage and marital status, for he had a castle full of premium-bred sons. There were so many matches that could be made out there, it was all rather overwhelming. It perhaps should have fallen to Mare to arrange these matters, but Robert was seeing little of her those days. There was just a glimpse in all those weeks when a messenger opened his bedroom door slightly and Robert felt narrowed eyes stabbing his soul from across the antechamber. The messenger, incidentally, was reporting that the newly conquered Welsh were trying to rise up. "Kill them," Robert replied, focusing more on edging his chair out of the demon gaze of his beloved. In winter, a family milestone was passed. Robert of Maine the Younger turned 16 and was granted his county in full. His first big court event was a Christmas feast to which all of the nobles of Rouen and beyond were drawn, eager to honour, or curse, the heir to the Normandy dynasty. King Robert was rather grumpy though, for it was only on his arrival that he found his boy had gone ahead and acquired himself a wife. She was just some other Norman. Highborn, of course, the daughter of an old traitor from the duchy days. What a selfish little brat. Such a powerful weapon an unmarried heir can be for a king, and Robert Jr. had taken the hand not of a princess or queen, but a mere girl from the next town over. And to say girl is to use the wider definition, for she was nearly twice his age. King Robert sat and watched all fawning over his heir, delighting in his friendly demeanour, his humble yet proud reception of gifts and well wishes, and his mature and stately manner of speech and composure even at that young age. Who was this stuck-up boy? The king wondered. He'd have plenty of time to ponder the answer, for no one spoke to him that evening. He felt quite passed over as he wandered off in the early hours of the morning, the croaky kowtowing of the stable hand confirming that he was at least still visible to other people. On the way back to Rouen he passed a disused inn. It was in a prime position on the main road to the Seine Bridge into the city. There was something greatly alluring and mysterious about the sight, so Robert dismissed his guards and removed his royal robe, immediately taking on the image of a mere bedraggled wanderer. Asking around, he discovered that the old mistress of the tavern had been pressed into joining the servants in Rouen Castle after many died of the slow fever. She had apparently caught the illness herself, attending to some brattish child of that fat king, and never managed to return home. Now her own children lived in the dampening remains of the old drinking hole, making of themselves bardic beggars and stealing a toll from passing merchants. After the mysterious stranger moved on, as chance would have it, a group of men from the city appeared in the village and paid those children a hefty sum to go away. A few noisy days later, and the inn was much more presentable. A painter tended to the new sign hanging out over the road. "The King's Bounty," it read. While a mysterious benefactor sponsored such crafts, the king, surely unrelated to the venture, was working out how to prove to the realm he was still driving the carriage, so to speak. The eventual decision was to invade Brège to the west, making use of his son's stupid curse of true love to press the wife's old family claim to some territory. This led soon enough to a great battle in Evreux, just down the road from Robert's new business. It was perfect. Fleeing civilians make hungry customers. The presence of the King's Guard outside the tavern tempted many to take refuge inside, and soon it was packed with so-called customers, sampling the special grand opening offer, Free turnips. Yes, I said free turnips. But then again, is anything truly free? Not in this case, for Robert's evil genius scheme was to salt these turnips so heavily that one would be forced to pay up for the pricey mead to stave off self-mummification. The foolish peasants took the bait, and their wincing faces gave Robert great delight from his stealthy perch atop the roof slats. Below, his guests were to be entertained by a talking wild ass, purported to know the epic poem of Robert and the Manticore. Crisis struck as the creature's voice was cruelly taken away, leaving only a stinking mule befouling the stage before some cynical peasants. They'd seen this act before. Robert tried whispering the poem down through the rafters, but the mule's sudden violent escape from the building drowned out that rasping recital. Things were not set to improve from there, for by now the salted turnips with extra salt served dans le style de sel had reached the patrons' stomachs. It was a brief stopover before the speedy return journey to the outside world. Gasping, clawing and gagging, the crowd tore the doors from the frame and fled the malodorous scene. The guards outside rushed in, before reeling at the buffering explosion of their senses and joining the routed punters. All that was left was a dripping mess of partially digested turnips and bodily waste. From the rafters, Robert was indeed the king of all he surveyed. In the coming weeks he decided to sell the property off, and quite literally wash his hands of the matter. At least he had learned a new technique to get court to end early. Back at home he heard that his forces had defeated the Brescians and were beginning the westward conquest as intended. But that wasn't the good news. That came with the fall of evening, when the cooks reported that someone had stolen most of the castle's reserve of salt, meaning the freshly hunted meats would have to all be consumed right away, lest they spoil. At the impromptu feast, Robert pressed poor Solène, thin and frail since her months abed, to consume all she could. Solène tried to refuse, for in her teenage years she had become obsessed with maintaining her dainty appearance, and with setting a good example to her people with a holy temperance. However, of all the people in the world, she was the most willing to hear Robert's wisdom, and when he ranted at length about how all the great moments of his life had happened while eating, it inspired in her a change of heart. She would soon rebound into quite the glutton, but whether this truly attracted greatness of anything other than mass is hard to say. By year's end, the war in France was over, and the newly titled county of Rennes was handed to Robert the Younger by his illustrious, industrious and belter-justious father. He promised much more to come. Indeed, he promised a crown, for while he did not entirely trust the strange man his son had become, he was the scion of House Normandy and firstborn of the world's greatest human being. You may think that a tad overblown, yet the electors of England were starting to agree. A couple of English dukes actually started supporting the idea of keeping the French overlords into the next generation. The fact that elections were allowed at all was still an issue, but taking away such fundamental and long-standing rights required a light touch, a touch Robert was reliably advised against attempting. Instead, he took advantage of the current feelings of goodwill to betray the Duke of Essex. He cancelled the boy's betrothal to his daughter Matilda so that she might instead be joined with a Prince of Norway. With this, it would be easier to keep that recurring Norwegian claim to England in check, and besides, a mere duke was too lowly for the daughter of Robert. The Norwegians refused Robert's obvious ploy, yet his trump card was yet to be played. His daughter would not marry a duke nor a prince, but a king. A young lad had become King of Navarra in Spain, and his minders were happy to make a gesture of peace with England, granting House Normandy another queen-in-waiting in the dynasty. As the year 1111 drew to a close, the minds of the English electors had changed. This was not an uncommon thing. There was constant back-and-forth debate on whether Robert's foreign line had earned another shot at ruling England, especially with so many able Englishmen waiting in the wings. There was no guarantee that when the crown fell from Robert's head, it would land on someone with the same great name. Simply declaring England to be a French-style monarchy was not out of the question, but nothing of the sort could be arranged while England and France both were at war with the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, the behemoth of Central Europe was invading France at that time, and by the same treaties that forced France to win Robert's civil wars for him, Robert was now forced to defend the realm of his old liege, and indeed Normandy if the Germans got that far. Englishmen and Normans alike were summoned to war then, the biggest war that would be seen for many generations before and after, as most were well aware. They weren't the only ones heading for France though. Robert and his family joined Solène on a stately trip to Paris, where they bore witness to her union with French heir Philippe, amid music, dancing and revelling fit for a future king and queen. The wines served were strong enough to facilitate the whole family being there. 4 parents, 7 children. A king, a queen, a regent, 2 queens in waiting, and maybe a king in waiting too. The Normandy clan was not just the Duchy of William the Bastard anymore. Relatively speaking, they just about had it all, except happiness. Mummy Mare and Auntie Agatha both got Solène ladylike weapons as wedding gifts, served with the advice to watch her new groom's courtiers carefully and to strike without mercy. Robert the Elder got them an embroidered tapestry of his own image, great insulation, while Robert the Younger presented a family treasure, a golden diadem that was said to have belonged to their grandmother, acquired at great expense from a far-off land. How far those birds fly, the king noted. It was ultimately something of a happy day for the family, a day of healing and of hope. In history it lies set against the oncoming years of turmoil, in which the future of the English throne would be so violently decided. Duke Edwin the Bold of Mercia was England's most famous military commander, and its most powerful duke. He would have been king if not for the meddling army of France supporting the failed innkeep Robert. Now, in 1112, he found himself leading that very same French army, bolstered with the bravest of the English fiefs, to fight the mighty host of the Holy Roman Empire. It was one of the largest and most brutal battles of the medieval period, seeing nearly 10,000 of the 30,000 combatants killed or wounded, among them Norman Count Robert of O. Thanks to Edwin's masterful strategy, the German army had been split down the centre, and thus saw the better part of those casualties. As fate would have it, it was in this way that French King Philip was repaid for his work trying to kill this same Edwin in the years prior. The victory was widely celebrated, but alas, it would later become known only as a good start to a great ordeal. In Rouen, the man who had been forced to force someone else to save France, King Robert of England, stood before some poor Breton who had been previously caught funding Welsh troops. On the king's grinning command, a mailed assistant turned the handle on the brand new dungeon rack. Were a philosopher of the Far East to visit the court in Rouen, he would have predicted that such things were happening in the night-veiled prison tower, for in life all things must be in balance. For Robert to have been acting so calmly and rationally around his court and family as he had been recently, he must have been relaxing in an equally remarkable fashion. Indeed, the more stretched his prisoner became, the more relaxed he felt, and soon Robert felt so relaxed he could just die. For Edwin of Mercia, the situation was quite the opposite. Just before his 70th birthday, he fell fatally ill somewhere in the Low Countries, passing away within days. He died a hero to his men, and the peoples of England, Normandy and France, who had all feared him as an opponent and found their salvation with him as an ally and a leader. Tears enough were shed for him to drown a king, even one as buoyant as Robert. Without him, the English army began to falter, and the French army it had marched with went its own way, eventually to be cornered and defeated by the Germans. The English would meet the same end if they stayed on the continent, and luckily enough, Robert ordered them to sail for England all of a sudden. Their king was going to offer them the luxury of fighting on their own soil, but we are getting ahead of the story. Matters began when Robert's daughter Matilda came to the king with a tale of bad behaviour. She claimed that a servant in Rouen had been talking to a strange man who kept coming to the castle, talking in English. The child was among the few in Normandy versed enough in the language to know what they were talking about. The servant was selling military information to an agent of King Merliswegen. Robert had laughed the tall tale away. The lies she would come up with to pretend she had a good reason to stay up past her bedtime. Incredible, the imagination of a child. He could respect her dedication to the lie, though. The more he questioned it, the more she insisted it was true, providing quickly invented details that gave off not a whiff of falsehood. But of course, it all must have been a lie in the end, for all knew that old King Merliswegen was safely stowed in a hole in the ground somewhere in the southern reaches of the Cotswold Hills. However, many moons later, information to the contrary arose. If you recall, King Robert had once employed an officer named Robert de Conteville, known these days as Robert de Conversano. King Robert had helped to organise the lesser Robert's death in order to please his sister Agatha and one Avis de Clare from his old court in Maine. This death had never come to pass, and the king and Agatha both had switched their murderous focus onto others over time. Madame de Clare, however, had lived a life of vendetta, and was now said to be camped outside a church in Westminster, in which Robert de Conversano was chaplain. In fact, he was the highest chaplain in England at the time, having proved to be an extremely dedicated man of God, ensuring he always kept himself to monasteries where women, especially murderous ones, were forbidden to tread. King Robert, not recognising the man as the same servant he had prepared a poisoned wine for and subsequently spilled decades earlier, he had told de Conversano to go to Rome and secure the legitimacy of House Normandy's claim to England with the new Pope, before promptly forgetting England ever had a High Chaplain. De Clare had thus been camping on those holy steps in vain, but she would not walk away empty-handed. A haggard man with a striking resemblance to the old King of England had come to those same steps, seeking the same chaplain, and the chance to overturn the papacy's opinion of the new king. It was love at first sight. Their wild nights were soon famous in Westminster, with all the inns knowing of the rich, slurring lovers swaying down the streets in linen jesters' crowns, shouting of how they were to kill many a Robert and be king and queen of all England. Their loud romance thus revealed to all parties concerned that Merliswegen was out and about with legitimate claim to the throne. Many English lords were interested, not just when it came to electing a successor to King Robert, but perhaps for something a little more violent and immediate. And so at last we reached the point alluded to previously. Robert, knowing what must be done, returned his men to England and arranged an audience with Duke Merliswegen. He accused the Duke of being publicly drunk and plotting to murder a man of God, two crimes to which there were witnesses aplenty. No duke and wannabe king could ever admit to such bawdy acts, so he was forced to deny the claims through war. Since the war was specifically about Merliswegen's right to shout drunken threats on a warm summer's night, his allies in the bid for the throne, the Dukes of York and Essex, could not be seen supporting him. Thus, Robert's force was guaranteed to win out over Merliswegen's levy, and give the king another notch on his bedpost, which he was of course using to count the number of civil wars he had won, like any true man of ambition. Ultimately then, young Matilda's sleuthing had been justified all along. The thing was, Robert had not only laughed at her at the time, but had never returned to the matter and overturned his previous judgment. The girl's ambitions had been squashed by this stonewalling from her father. Her tutors reported to Robert that she suddenly seemed uninterested in anything they had to say. Robert put a word in with God to maybe sort her out, but one could suppose God didn't consider that to be his responsibility, and even resented the request. Perhaps he was bored, for instead he bent the rivers of fate in a frustrating fashion. Another young Matilda was inspired to serve her noble father Robert. I speak now of Matilda, Countess of O, the 8-year-old inheritor to fallen Robert of O, and would-be avenger of her father's death through a declaration of war on King Philip of France, the man who had refused command of the right flank in that great battle, and hence had seen her father killed. King Robert turned a blind, bloodshot eye to that whole affair. Not long after that, Merliswegen was finally moved into his new home in Rouen Dungeon, where he would pass away within a year. Another claimant to the throne was gone, but there were plenty more for the English electors to choose from. Around that time, the current favourite was Sinhelm of Mercia, son of the late Edwin the Bold. He had no claim to the throne at all, really, yet he might get it if the petty dukes were allowed to exercise that strange voting right they all claimed to have. Robert would never convince them of how stupid they were all being when all were talking of military matters at every court session, so he had to pray the French got on and surrendered to the Germans without too much delay. One wonders if God reinterpreted his request into another context there as well. In 1116 at least, the matter would drag on for many years yet. That meant Robert had to play the English game. He had to 1. Convince English lords to support his dynasty, such as with the latest war against Scotland to expand the Duchy of Northumberland, and 2. Kill or imprison his most popular rivals, such as with his attempt to arrest Sinhelm for plotting usurpation, sparking another civil war. Just as with the last one, Robert's men were ready at the starting blocks for the next inevitable breakdown of the realm, and jumped into action before the Mercians even found out why they were at war with the rest of England again. In both of those wars, things had gone suspiciously smoothly, and Robert was soon to find out why. The Scottish and Mercian armies had decided to smuggle themselves onto the mainland and join forces to attack Rouen. Together, they could almost match Robert's army. Yet to defeat both of these foes at once would only prove to the electors that God was on Robert's side, so he happily ordered that battle be joined. But he didn't have Edwin the Bold fighting for him this time. He didn't have King Philip of France fighting for him this time. It was just his own men, with his own household commanders, who he had never taken any interest in training or selecting for any special talent. Thus, the battle was fought without much consideration. The English plied their trade with their longbows for a while, then charged into the Allied lines, saw that said lines looked much more heavily armoured and serious up close, and immediately retreated. The Allies pursued and turned the day into a rout, leaving the English without the strength to attack again, and the Allies with all the time they needed to breach and occupy Rouen. Robert was now a prisoner in his own castle. His lines of communication with the outside world were severely limited, leaving him in a most dire situation. He was forced to spend time with his wife. Outside their chamber, the guards chatted in a tongue-twisting Highland fashion. The couple listened to it carefully, anything to hear not the continuing silence between them. Their children and assistant mothers were confined to their own rooms until Robert formally ended the war, so all the eyes of House Normandy were on him, none more piercingly so than Mayre's. Robert stood at his window for most of the passing days, muttering of victory, chewing on chicken legs and sucking on bones maddeningly loudly. Mayre refused to let the oaf keep her from her children, her real children that is, any longer. One night a raven landed at the window, carrying on its talons a vial of black liquid and a note from Richard, brother of the king. It simply read, "Save us all, for God's sake." The next morning came, along with the next serving of chicken legs. Mare carefully laced the greasy treat with the black poison, which diluted into the fats and became quite unnoticeable. Then all she needed to do was sit back in bed and watch Robert emerge from the privy, march to the table to collect his first breakfast, then turn to take his last look out at the kingdom he had won. Yes, come to think of it, Robert had done rather a lot with his life, hadn't he? Never had he faltered before, and nor did he now. Such courage and confidence, such nobility. Ah, but he thinks nothing of his own family, Mare assured herself. Let him bite down on his fate, his just desert. Robert raised a piece of the chicken to his mouth, but halted. Mare could not dare breathe. Then it was lowered again, before Robert turned and admitted that he could not eat any more, when he did not even know if poor Matilda was being fed properly, and even less of Selene at the mercy of the Germans in Paris. Mare emitted a strange gasp, scrambled forward to take the plate from her husband, and then without hesitation cast the food from the window, her tears washing the plate clean. There would be times all too soon when she would regret not going through with her scheme, but perhaps had she actually done so, there would be far more she would regret. As for the siege of Rouen, that situation would, funnily enough, be resolved by a very similar drama far to the north, where English troops had Scottish King Ronald also cooped up with his family. Ronald had not the will to stand it any longer, and surrendered to the English, with news of this arriving just as the English were in full retreat from a failed attempt to take the city. 1,200 Scots marched off to return home then, allowing the surviving English to eventually regroup and overwhelm the Mercians. Robert's fortunes had bounced back from the brink once again. Matilda turned 16 just as the countryside in Rouen was cleansed of rebels, and off she went to Navarra to sit as queen. Just to the south, the French were prying the Germans out of their own capital, and as it happened, the Emperor soon decided to cancel his invasion, even though it was progressing quite well. Perhaps he feared the spectre of a newly reunified England rejoining the fray. Reasonable, perhaps, but we know today that England was still a long way from unification. Putting the schism of Mercia and Greater England aside, a great shattering of the Normandy family was about to take place. Robert had spent many months living in the near-exclusive company of his wife, speaking of their children, their kingdom, and the dynasty. It seemed that over the years they really had shared quite the adventure together, even if they had not always rode side by side. After such times and inviting sentiments, when court resumed and Adeline and Bava flanked his throne, he could hardly bear to speak with them. Suddenly he saw the matriarchal triumvirate of House Normandy as the badge of betrayal and selfishness that others complained of. It was time, at last, for the madness to end. He dismissed both mistresses from his court, and later informed them that it would be better if they no longer came to visit him in Rouen Castle. There was nothing the two women could do to hang on to their lives as de facto royalty. Even the fact that their children were the princes and princesses of the realm was useless, for Robert had legitimized them, so while all knew the open truth of the matter, when it came to legal formalities, Mare was mother of them all. Regent Adeline and royal consort Bava were thus struck from the rolls and sent to live out their days in a strange-smelling inn just outside of the city. Robert did the courtesy of paying, but then again, it was the cheapest inn for quite some distance. Now the English army just needed to boot the Mercians off the continent, then return to the continent themselves to finish the job, restoring power to the emptying nest in Rouen. Yet nothing is so simple in a Frenchman's England. Now the Duke of Essex, the one who Princess Matilda should at that very moment be marrying according to Robert's long-forgotten promise, declared himself King of England, and the Duke of York pledged his support. Civil war with a side of civil war. That bedpost was going to be less notched and more splintered before long. Robert was rather at a loss. He was 65 years old, which was quite the burden for a man who had lived through a lifetime of constant peril and betrayal, war and wine. He could only remain in Rouen, now willingly cohabiting with Mare and his youngest offspring. Throughout his life he had asked God what must be done to finally allow him to be happy. Now he discussed with his family a slightly reworded query. What should he do to make them all happy? The answer was ultimately that he had already done everything he needed to do. The peril of the time was only superficial. 3 kings of England there might be, but the Mercian was many times defeated now, and the Essexer would soon have to face the newly available armies of France. The Normandy dynasty had been risen from a sneered-at dukedom living on borrowed land to the overlords of a rich and expanding kingdom that now rivaled the one wreathed in the laurels of their old Frankish overlords, all on the watch of King Robert. There was just one thing left to perfect his legacy: to have his heir, Robert of Maine the Younger, start where the elder had finished, as king. Winning the dual civil wars of the age would give him more than enough momentum to override his vassals and declare a traditional monarchy. And as said, victory was inevitable in both cases. In fact, the Mercians were effectively beaten already. But there was a catch. Sinhelm knew that his king would surely look to crush the electors in the aftermath of the war. Hence, he had to arrange for the war to be impossible to conclude formally. To that end, he declared war on the petty kings of Ireland and Wales and invited them to invade Mercian territory. All he had to do was get himself captured, and now Robert's messengers carrying the terms to end the rebellion would never be able to find him. It worked perfectly. Robert was told by some Irish lord that the English would have to take that Mercian coward back from their cold, dead hands, and no messengers were allowed anywhere near him. So then, while not much fighting took place, Mercia remained apart from England, and the administration of the region remained in chaos. The Duke of Essex had his dreams of royalty crushed in short order, and the Duke of York slunk back to his seat on the King's Council without anyone paying him too much attention. That left only the wars with the Lords of Britannia from outside England's borders, one of whom was rumoured to be keeping the Duke of Mercia as a jester. Very few English troops remained able to fight after a decade of constant war, so getting Sinhelm back was not a guarantee. Let also be taken into consideration that Rouen was once again set to siege by a Mercian warband, and overall it will be no surprise that Robert was at his wits' end. He was on the verge of securing the complete and incontestable usurpation of the English throne after countless battles, countless rebellions, and countless proofs of his destiny. But the final piece of the puzzle was hidden in darkness, in reach, but too small and soft to the touch to be found with his failing strength. As the year 1120 progressed, he was increasingly confined to his bed, his desperation to hang on and see his dreams fulfilled only pushing his overloaded body closer to the edge. In March, he commissioned a great memorial painting of his father William to be placed in Rouen's Grand Hall. The final image portrayed William standing beneath a tree, reaching up at a golden crown hanging from the branches. It was beyond his reach, yet at his side was a young boy looking out at the viewer with a grin. In the boy's hands was a golden saw. The sight of this work produced from Robert the last of his overly long bouts of laughter, interrupted as it was with splurting, coughing, and clawing gestures towards the empty wine jug on the table. In July, as men searched for Sinhelm in war-torn Wales, news arrived that Adeline had passed away of old age over at the King's Bounty, aka the Salted Turnip. It was hard for Mare to find the energy to comfort poor bedridden Robert on this matter, but even she could see the romance in it. Those two had been together for pretty much their whole lives, from the draughty halls of Le Mans in those first winters, to the warm waters of Bath for Robert's coronation, from the messy battlefields across the realm to the orderly quiet of Rouen Castle. Adeline had ever been Robert's companion, and by the shared experience of motherhood, she hadn't quite ever been May's enemy. She was given a formal funeral befitting a woman of nobility, which was to be the last public event that tired old Robert would attend. Not helped by the sadness of the affair, his health worsened, and it became clear that the minds of the English electors would soon have to be made up. The way the dice had fallen may have frustrated Robert's final ambition, but there was a rather remarkable silver lining to it all. The most popular candidate for the throne was Sinhelm, but he was not only missing but was a wanted man, legally speaking, so his supporters would have to either take up arms and join the war, or find someone else to vote for. No one took the former path. Additionally, there was the realm of Northumbria, which had grown greatly with House Normandy's support. On the south coast, where Normans did not seem so foreign, there was support for a continued union across the Channel also. That December, all of these factors combined turned one Robert of Maine the Younger into Robert II of England. His father had passed of illnesses unknown, thought to be brought on by his constant worry for his legacy. He was right to be worried, for his personal reputation left much to be desired. Many across Britannia and France nodded in satisfaction to the refrain that the cruel king would be punished for his sins in the afterlife. Yet none could deny that as the head of House Normandy, there had been none better. Not yet, anyway, for King Robert II was not at all like his father. He was adored in his counties of Maine and Rennes, known for an astonishing lack of greed, malice or foul humour given the beast that spawned him. Soon the English would come to adore him too, as he not only outshone their own nobility by his charm and composure, but eagerly took to the task of pursuing English interests at war. Over the next few years, the Welsh and Irish incursions were halted. Sinhelm was recovered and transferred to Rouen to serve his rightful punishment, and England was at last able to enjoy unity and peace. And if they ever got tired of that, the king could press further claims on England's borders to continue the English rise to dominance, and perhaps become the new Alfred the Great. The dream of a united England would stand aside for the dream of a united Britannia. So then, it seemed that England truly was going to be left in good hands, rather cleaner than the last pair. Now the prospect of removing the English electors was only a matter of time. House Normandy's destiny seemed yet more grand, and promised much more than a crown before the end. That is not to say that all was suddenly perfect. For example, the king's mother, Mère, was well aware that her luxurious life in Rouen could easily be overturned if someone pointed out the commonly known fact that the consort, Bava, was Robert's real mother. So it was that Bava was eventually found dead in a pile of turnips. While Mère must have been the prime suspect, the news was drowned out by the talk from Paris. Prince Philip had suddenly died of illness, leaving Princess Solène widowed at 25 and no longer married to a royal heir. After hearing this whole tale, you can probably imagine how she felt. She grew up being told again and again that she would be queen. She had been told that it was her destiny, her right, and that nothing was to stand in her way. She had been promised a crown, but suddenly it had been snatched away without warning. A lesser woman may have accepted her fate. A lesser woman may have allowed God to play his little jokes on House Normandy unopposed. But Princess Solène had learned from the best. With chicken in one hand and a forged document in the other, she set out to follow her father into the history books, one way or another. Did she make it? Well, I'm afraid that's another story entirely. Thank you very much for watching / listening to The Promised Crown. A very special thanks goes out to all of the Officially Devon patrons who fund the channel and make projects like this possible. If you're feeling particularly rich, you can check the links in the description to contribute yourself. So I guess that's it. I've been Offie D, and thanks again for joining me for this series.